Attention, attention, this is History Lost in Time. And welcome to episode 34 of the History Lost in Time podcast. After a short break, I'll continue with the radio broadcasting history of Germany, and I'll start in communist East Germany. In this episode, I'll talk about radio broadcasting in the Soviet occupation zone SOZ. The topic of this episode. Radio remained the leading medium after 1945 and was only slowly replaced at the top by TV around 1960. So it makes sense to discuss the time from 1945 to 1960 in a few episodes. At the moment, I'm thinking not to go beyond 1960, but that decision isn't final yet. I will start with communist East Germany because currently I have more material about that. Political agenda and background. None. I will use terms like Soviet Occupation Zone, SOZ, Communist East Germany and German Democratic Republic, GDR, not because I enjoy using Cold War terms, but because those are the historical terms used back then and in the sources. SOZ is the proper term for the years 1945 to 49, because back then there was no GDR yet. The sources that were used. I have 3 books as sources and all 3 of them are interesting. Adelheid von Saldern, Inge Marsolek. Zuhören und gehört werden 2. Radio in der DDR der 50er Jahre zwischen Lenkung und Ablenkung. Translation: Listen and being listened to. 2. Radio in the GDR during the 1950s. From controlling to distracting. Published by Verlag Edition Discord, Tübingen, 1998. As usual, this book deals with rather unusual radio broadcasting topics. The book was published during the late 1990s, so after the reunification of Germany. Bonner Berichte aus Mittel- und Ostdeutschland, der Rundfunk in der sowjetischen Besatzungszone Deutschlands. Translation: Bonn reports from Central and East Germany, radio broadcasting in the Soviet occupation zone. Published by Dr. Gerhard Walter and the Federal Ministry of All German Questions, Federal German Publishing Agency, Bonn-Berlin, 1961. This book was published during the hot phase of the Cold War by a West German ministry. It is very confrontational and avoids using the term GDR as much as possible. Heide Riedel, Hörfunk und Fernsehen in der DDR, ein Projekt des Deutschen Rundfunkmuseums. Translation: Radio and Television Broadcasting in the GDR, a project of the German Broadcasting Museum, published by Literarischer Verlag Helmut Braun, Köln, 1977. This study was written during the 1970s when the Cold War calmed down a bit. Author Heide Riedel has a more balanced view on the GDR radio broadcasting. It is evident that at the time the opinion was that the GDR might exist permanently and that one had to find a way to coexist. Despite the rather friendly approach, Heide Riedel had to work without any help from the GDR because all her requests regarding material and interviews were ignored. For German listeners to radio broadcasting, as far as they were able to listen at all, the time between late April 1945 and the middle of May 1945 was rather, shall we say, varied. Those that were not dead, bombed out or fleeing still suffered because of the collapsing infrastructure, a lack of everything including electricity and spare parts, and they had to worry about other things than radio broadcasting reception. In the area of the Soviet occupation zone, 7% of all homes were destroyed and 12% were damaged. A significant improvement of the situation was not in sight, and things only improved by the 1950s when the GDR rebuilt and many citizens fled to West Germany. Since millions of Germans had been expelled from their homes in the East, the SOZ had to provide for a lot more people than in pre-war times. If a citizen of the SOZ even had a home, they could only call 7.6 square meters their own. That's about 81.8 square feet per person. Just calculate what that means for your own home. How many people would have to live there under such conditions? Still, Some people were still listening to radio broadcasts, but what was there to listen to? The Greater German broadcasting was collapsing, but until May 13, 1945, some messages were still being broadcast via the Flensburg radio station, which, in theory, could be received in all of Germany. A quote from Erich Kästner from April 30, 1945, from page 259 of the Listen and Being Listened to book describes the impression the German author had in the south of Germany. It was a silent day. Not only the Munich station kept quiet, foreign stations remained silent as well. Lies on the radio, both the most blatant and the subtle, are open to interpretation. The vast silence is puzzling. Today, during the day, the Munich station was silent for hours. It was as if it were broadcasting silence. At 10 o'clock in the evening, as we sat in the Waldcafé, it suddenly stirred again. And what did it bring? Hot music. First uncommented radio silence, then un-German jazz without words. What has happened? The silence ended on May 13, 1945. Quote from pages 259 to 60. Shortly after the declaration of surrender, the last fascist message had been broadcast over the Flensburg radio station. The employees of the Psychological Warfare Division in Bad Homburg detected a station on the frequency of the former Greater German Broadcasting, whose programming they found difficult to explain. They not only heard familiar announcers from the former Greater German Broadcasting, classical concerts and folk music, radio plays and readings by German authors, but also commentaries that created the impression that the Soviet Union was a friend and helper of all good Germans. The employees of the monitoring department described the programming of the German-language Berlin radio station, which went on air on May 13th with the support of the Soviet military administration in Germany. On April 30, 1945, the Ulbricht Group, which was a group of leading German communists in exile in the Soviet Union, had already arrived in Berlin. Their task was to create pro-Soviet state structures in the Soviet-occupied parts of Germany that should remain part of a future German state. So basically everything west of the Oder-Neiße line up to the front lines of the Western Allies. Part of this was the quick restoration of radio broadcasting. Initially, the Soviets had ordered to confiscate all radios. However, this order was revoked quickly. Instead, the plan now was to create a pro-Soviet radio broadcasting, which wouldn't just reach the Germans in the Soviet-occupied zone, but all Germans, so also those within the areas occupied by the Western Allies. Quote, page 261. In keeping with this communication function, the Berlin radio station quickly began broadcasting programs in which, in the face of flight, expulsion, destruction, and disruption, relatives searched for their loved ones at noon. It developed a program called What We Need to Know, which was soon followed by the reporting program Heartbeat Berlin. By 1945, there was no longer a debate about the usefulness of radio broadcasting. It was a part of life of the industrialized nations. However, the question whether reception of radio broadcast was possible was a valid one. Because of widespread destruction and a collapsed infrastructure, electricity was a problem. Also, there were no spare parts for radios except on the black market. And basic goods like food, clothing, and medicine were simply more important. That's why families, houses, and even entire streets shared working radio devices. In the direct months and years following the war, even simple detector radios were being sold, just like in the 1920s. The first post-war production of vacuum tubes for radios started in September 1945 at the RTF VEB Funkwerk Erfurt. According to experts, the technological level regarding new radio devices of 1948 had only reached the pre-war level of 1936. On May 13, 1945, the Berlin radio station was able to resume broadcasting thanks to the Broadcasting House and the surviving infrastructure of the old Greater German Broadcasting. The Broadcasting House had been occupied by the Soviets on May 2nd. The Berlin radio station was the first German post-war radio station. The first program from May 13th only had a length of 1 hour. It consisted of the national anthems of the four victorious powers and announcements from the Allies. Radio broadcasting had defeated traditional press by 2 days because the first newspaper, Tägliche Rundschau, was launched on May 15th. By May 22nd, the Berlin radio station already broadcast a 19-hour program per day, and it included everything that the Germans were used to: reports, news, music, and culture. The Berlin radio station was led by members of the German Communist Party, but it was controlled and censored by the Soviet military administration in Germany, the SMAD. The censorship was performed by Soviet military officers from 1945 to 49. Curiously, the Soviet censorship turned out to be more open and liberal than the German censorship that started in late 1949. Quote from the Heider-Riedel book, page 40. In the first weeks and months after the end of the war, the radio, under the direction of the SMAD, was given two main tasks. One, to provide information about the political situation in Germany and that of the other countries involved in the war. Two, to lay the foundations for the restructuring of political, economic, and social life. Both the Soviet Union as well as the leadership of the German Communist Party realized that radio broadcasting could be and would have to be a major support pillar of the new regime. A centralized and effective control of radio broadcasting was therefore absolutely necessary. Quote from the Listening and Being Listened to book, page 113. Like in all areas, the SED leadership installed a centralized principle of rule in the important mass medium of broadcasting as part of the state apparatus. Through planning guidelines, censorship measures, controlled personnel policies, political ideological training, as well as repression and spying on employees, the SED state attempted to keep the medium under complete control and use it for its own purposes. It was important that the content of the radio broadcasts was anti-fascist and democratic. In the beginning, that actually included opinions from non-communist parties, although the communists always had priority and got more broadcasting time. News were initially real and not propaganda like in Nazi times. Already in May, there were report shows like What We Need to Know, which provided practical help for the population, for example, information where and when food and clothing was being distributed. Also, there were political shows like Heartbeat Berlin. Both shows included serious and cheerful content. By late May 1945, there was also already a 2-hour morning show. Another important early program was the Search program, which was used to find missing people and to inform people that someone was alive and where that someone could be found. Another program was the Echo of Time, which discussed the economic situation and the daily improvements that happened in Berlin. One goal of the all-day program was to create a feeling of new normality. By late 1945, 55% of the content of the program was music. Information programs were in second place with 26%. The number of listeners was rising fast. By September 1945, there were 1.2 million registered radio devices in the Soviet-occupied zone. By January 1950, there were already 3.3 million. And not to forget, a single device provided radio services to several people. And yes, it also means that there was a radio device fee in Communist East Germany. This fee, which was originally created in the Weimar Republic, also existed within the Third Reich, Communist East Germany, and Democratic West Germany. Money from taxes and fees is always welcome, no matter what ideology a state is following. The literary scholar Viktor Klemperer is being quoted on pages 260-261 in the Listening and Being Listened to book. He gives us his impression regarding the early post-war program of the Berlin radio station. The radio takes up a lot of time, but is very interesting. Although essentially only Berlin can be grasped, and only well in the evenings, and although only occasionally pleasant, often insignificant music is played. But the Berlin news shows the horrific disruption and the miserably laborious reconstruction in detail. They announced train connections, that one can already travel to Oranienburg twice a day, that on even days a train goes almost as far as Magdeburg, that a freight train is already reaching Dresden, etc. A lecture urgently calls on Berliners to plant winter cabbage now, since nothing can be expected from the devastated province of Brandenburg, and certainly nothing from further afield. The mayor of Brandenburg is urgently requested by this means, by radio, because there is no mail, to come to Berlin for an important meeting. Every evening, long lists are passed around. Greetings, meaning the names and addresses of people who introduce themselves to their circle as alive and present again. In the West and the East, people distanced themselves quickly from Third Reich politics. However, the social conditioning that people had received in Imperial Germany, the Weimar Republic, or the Third Reich couldn't be changed that quickly. Either by choice or by chance, the Soviet zone broadcasting quickly picked up the hostile attitude towards Western nations that had already existed in the German predecessor states. In September 1945, the regional radio station in Leipzig went back online. In December 1945, the stations in Dresden and Schwerin followed. In May 46, Potsdam was reactivated, in June Weimar, and in December Halle. The regional stations had to take over most of the programs from Berlin and were only allowed to create regional programs in a very limited fashion. A federal structure of the radio services, like in the Weimar Republic or in West Germany, was not wanted. Instead, the structure of the radio services was increasingly centralized, and the influence of regional stations was continuously reduced. In 1947, the General Directorate was created within the Ministry of People's Education, which took over control of all Soviet zone radio stations. Something that made radio reception difficult was the situation with the frequencies. Before the war, Germany had received a comfortable amount of medium-wave and long-wave frequencies due to its size and importance. However, after the war, that situation was obviously totally different, so Germany was assigned very few and rather bad frequencies. The consequence of that was that the Soviet zone programs were difficult to receive within Communist East Germany. While West Germany quickly focused on FM radio as an alternative, even though that had very limited range, East Germany was more reluctant. In 1945, East Germany only used 4 medium-wave frequencies. By 1950, that had increased to 7 medium-wave frequencies and 1 long-wave frequency. By the way, the so-called Valley of the Ignorant in Communist East Germany only applies to Western TV programs. West German radio programs could be received there and in good quality. During the Cold War years, Communist East Germany tried to portray West Germany as a continuation of the Third Reich, while it portrayed itself as totally disconnected from National Socialism. However, when you take a look at the people working in East German radio services in the late 1940s, one does find some continuity there. Even former Nazi Party members worked for communist broadcasting, admittedly in low numbers though. According to a statistic of the Listening and Being Listened to book, page 88, about 220 former Nazi Party members still worked for the communist broadcasting by 1951. They made up about 6% of the entire staff. This number was sinking but still remained above zero by the mid-1950s. And these numbers do not include the people that had been working for the Nazi radio services without being members of the Nazi Party. Why did the communists employ former Nazis? This is being explained on pages 85 following. However, the number of politically untainted individuals was far from sufficient to ensure the smooth running of a full-day broadcasting program. Thus, in the early days of broadcasting in the Soviet occupation zone, employees of the Nazi Broadcasting Service and former Nazi Party employees were also employed. Technicians were particularly taken on, as the Nazis had set high standards in this field that could not be easily matched. The same applied to orchestra musicians and speakers, as well as employees in non-editorial positions. It was not considered a major problem if a former Nazi worked in the technical field, as this area was ultimately classified more or less as non-political. In 1949 and 50, large numbers of people were fired from radio broadcasting, particularly former Nazi party members, Democrats, communist immigrants from the West who refused to follow the official party line, and others that were considered politically unreliable. Even small things could lead to a dismissal, which created an atmosphere of nervousness and distrust within the radio stations. At the same time, there was a major change regarding the programs. The post-war era within radio broadcasting was over, and a new socialist radio programming structure had to be established. The fact that both these measures happened at the same time led to a massive loss in quality and chaos. Programs were constantly cancelled or moved, which made listeners increasingly angry. The Radio Services magazine Radio Broadcasting, which was a communist state-run magazine, had to admit mistakes and promise to do better repeatedly. The leadership of the radio stations was obviously taken over by members of the Communist Party, usually those that had already worked in radio broadcasting in the Weimar Republic or during the exile from 1933 to 45. This ensured communist political influence. However, it also caused problems in the long run. The Communist Party members had not experienced the Greater German broadcasting, and they had little experience in creating and running an up-to-date entertainment program. Instead, they used old concepts and structures from Soviet broadcasting, which had catastrophic consequences for broadcasting in Germany. After all, the Germans had experienced the entertainment broadcasts of the Nazis from 1933 to 45, and they had gotten used to it. Nazi entertainment had been strictly apolitical, soft, shallow, and designed to distract. Such an entertainment concept, or any kind of entertainment concept at all, was missing within socialist broadcasting. Even worse, there was direct competition from Western radio stations, and they had a modern entertainment concept. There are several interesting quotes that point this out. On page 373 of the Listen and Being Listened to book, it says, "While a large part of the GDR broadcasting audience had experienced the media developments of the Third Reich, the broadcasting officials who had emigrated to the Soviet Union lacked experience with a radio that satisfied people's entertainment needs as professionally as Nazi broadcasting once had. For Ulbricht's leadership group, radio remained a means of propaganda and an instrument for the formation of a correct consciousness, that is, for the ideological training and political socialization of the people. The dilemma for the leadership elite in the GDR in the 1950s was that, in the opinion of those in charge, the construction of socialism was a highly serious matter, to whose propagation entertainment could contribute nothing essential." And page 22 of the same book says, "Radio entertainment was part of the seemingly apolitical. The GDR had more difficulty with entertainment than the National Socialists. The cheerful person was not a model for the GDR, but rather the insightful individual who attained his insights through enlightenment, education, and persuasion. In the self-image of the rulers, communism was based on a historical inevitability, and its realization turned out to be a deeply serious matter." Communist broadcasting wanted to be as different as possible from Nazi broadcasting. Therefore, even entertainment programs became political, which caused listeners to consider them political programs, not entertainment programs. It was repeatedly stressed that all programs had to be anti-fascist. However, the leadership of the Communist Party defined what was anti-fascist and what wasn't. Even a new kind of humor was expected, socialist humor, that was supposed to be of a higher level than bourgeois humor. In the end, this led to rather humorless programs. Let's take a look at word and news programs. Early on, these were supposed to bring real news, not propaganda messages like it had been the case under the Nazis, and initially even non-communists were allowed to have their say. However, the central guideline was always the following Ulbricht order. It has to look democratic, but we must have control. The Communist Party, and after the forced unification of communists and social democrats in East Germany in 1946, the Socialist Party, dominated within radio broadcasting. By 1946-47, this had turned into a monopoly. Differing opinions were no longer allowed, and the tolerated corridor of opinions became extremely narrow and was defined by the Socialist Party. Despite her rather diplomatic tone towards the GDR in her book, even Heide Riedel is very clear in her assessment when she writes on page 127, "As the description of its development shows, broadcasting in the GDR placed itself at the service of the ruling party, the SED, almost from the beginning. There was no freedom of opinion or freedom of the press in the Soviet-occupied zone and later the GDR. On paper, these freedoms did exist, but even official GDR documents limited these freedoms. They were not allowed to be abused or to be used to spread harmful ideologies. And what abuse and harmful ideologies were was defined by the socialist leadership. By that mechanism, it was possible to criminalize all differing opinions." In the book of the Ministry of All German Issues, several contemporary sources are quoted that react to this one-sided reporting. The ministry itself wrote down its opinion on page 7. There it says, "Public opinion is manipulated in the zone. There may be only one opinion in all journalistic organs, that of the party. Since 1945, the prevailing opinion has been determined by the Central Committee. The State Broadcasting Committee, as a subordinate body, monitors and directs broadcasting. It is a cog in the engine of totalitarian propaganda." The newspaper Der Telegraph wrote the following regarding the Berlin radio station on April 28, 1946, which can be found on page 15. "An example of the deliberately one-sided attitude of the Berlin broadcasting is its daily newspaper review. Although it is described as a cross-section of the Berlin press of the day, it actually only records press comments from the eastern sector. And since all press of the eastern sector was centrally managed as well, it was basically a cross-section of a single opinion." The Social Democratic Party of West Germany tried to work with the Berlin radio station until early 1947, but it finally gave up in frustration. The party newspaper Sozialdemokrat said the following on January 8, 1947, which can be found on page 120. "Let's state objectively that Berlin radio is spreading socialist propaganda. It doesn't provide objective news, omits important stories, and exaggerates irrelevant information if it sounds pro-socialist." And on page 17 you can find the following quote from January 23, 1947. "As long as these people continue their hate speech, no social democrat will speak on this station again." The West Berlin newspaper Der Abend is being quoted on page 18 with the following comment. "A Berlin broadcaster that has so little Berlin identity should no longer be allowed to use the name Berlin. For us it's just the Zone Broadcaster East." The political one-sidedness of the Berlin radio station led to rejection in Western Germany and in West Berlin, and since February 7, 1946, the Berlin radio station got some fierce competition. That was the day the RIAS, radio within the American sector, went online. Before, the Berlin radio station was all about winning over all Germans and unifying Germany under communist leadership. Now, however, the confrontation East versus West became the main topic. After the regional elections of 1946, which didn't turn out as well as the socialists had hoped for, the Berlin radio station switched from thinly veiled propaganda to open propaganda. Jubilation areas for the Soviet Union and devastating attacks against the West became the norm, and no party other than the socialist one was allowed to speak. By 1948, radio broadcasting in the Soviet zone was no longer a medium of journalism, but rather a political agitator. During the Berlin blockade of 1948-49, the Berlin radio station became a front line of the Cold War and lost its last remaining sympathies in the West. The broadcasting house was located within the western part of Berlin, however it was used by the Soviets and the Socialist Party. The transmission towers in Tegel were also located within the western sector. to retaliate against the blockade, but officially communicated as a measure to increase air traffic safety, the French blew up the transmission towers in Tegel and therefore took away the only means of broadcasting for the programs of the Berlin radio station. Broadcasting was taken over by the regional station in Leipzig until the new towers were finished in Königs Wusterhausen in the east in April 1949. The broadcasting house was not touched, but by now the Soviets and the Socialists realized that they would have to move soon. Construction of alternatives within the eastern sector was started already in 1946. Until the move, the Soviets and the Socialists used the broadcasting house in West Berlin as a base for espionage and subversive activities. One of the main differences between radio broadcasting in East and West was the opinion what the job of a journalist was supposed to be and what the job of news broadcasting was. The director of the Berlin radio station in 1946, Max Seidewitz, said the following, which can be read in the Listening and Being Listened to book on page 114. Undoubtedly, overcoming the material, intellectual, and moral ruins and building a new democratic Germany is a political task. Since broadcasting is obligated to actively participate in the necessary transformation process, it must be political. Broadcasting cannot be neutral in our time. It must take sides. So while radio broadcasting in the West was supposed to inform, educate, and entertain, the core of radio broadcasting in the East was political training. So a journalist was an intermediary of party politics and an activist, not someone looking for important stories that should be reported in an objective and fact-oriented way. Obviously, this ideal wasn't reached in the West either. However, there is a major difference between journalists that try to be objective but simply can't because of their human nature, and those journalists that don't even try to be objective because they have to or want to report in a one-sided fashion. It comes as no surprise that journalist training in the East focused mostly on political training and not really on actual journalism. This led to massive problems with the quality of news and magazines. The Ministry of All German Issues said the following on page 122. As a result of the restrictive regulations, the news seemed monotonous and boring. Editors had to meet a quota of reconstruction news or peace-fighting reports, and each broadcast had to contain at least 2 such reports. In 1949 and 50, listeners were told at the beginning of each news broadcast that so many days had passed since the end of the war and that there was still no peace treaty. For example, today is the day 1342 since the end of the war. We demand a peace treaty. And then there is this quote from page 124. The form of the news was as different as its content. News anchors were often unable to deliver the prescribed unradio-like sentences smoothly. Poor scripts caused even the best anchors to fail. Another problem was the Soviet style that was expected regarding news. This meant that public announcements and diplomatic notes were read in full length several times a day. It took many rounds of negotiations until the German communists were able to convince the Soviets to drop this format, which was used within Soviet radio broadcasting. On top of that, Soviet zone radio broadcasting expected its listeners to deny reality to some degree. In the Listening and Being Listened to book it says on page 27, the regime in the GDR also demanded that its population largely ignore certain experiences and realities, justifying this by portraying the Federal Republic and the West as enemies. It suspended the rule of law in favor of a supposedly higher law, and by defining itself as the heir to the anti-fascist tradition, it gave people a sense of superiority. The terms propaganda and agitation, which were basically made unusable due to their abuse under the Nazi rule, were used without hesitation by the communists, since they were part of core communist doctrine. According to that doctrine, propaganda was the distribution of Marxism to functionaries, while agitation was the distribution of Marxism to the masses. Reporting and news of the Soviet zone radio broadcasting used both concepts, but mostly agitation. All three sources agree that this kind of politicized and patronized broadcasting style by the communists was very unpopular with the Germans. As the post-war situation improved and people were able to think beyond immediate survival, they expected a broad spectrum of education and entertainment from their radio services. However, communist radio broadcasting simply didn't have that. The few entertainment programs that did exist contained politicized and patronized content, and on top of that were often interrupted with political special reports. Since there was an easy alternative thanks to Western radio stations, the population of communist East Germany increasingly switched to Western radio stations. This is all the more striking since the music program of the Berlin radio station had an amazing start. The music archive of the Greater German Broadcasting had survived the war, so the Berlin radio station was able to broadcast a wide array of different music. However, it lacked the infrastructure to produce new content, which became a problem over time. Back then, repeating the same music over and over again was considered as an impoverishment of the supply and annoying. However, even the West German Ministry of All German Issues admits on page 162, between 1945 and 49, the Berlin radio station broadcast an appealing music program, and the work of the music department was repeatedly praised in the Berlin press. The station was even called the music broadcaster in Europe. The Soviets were very keen to restart the cultural department of the German radio services in order to cover the cultural demands of all Germans and in order to give the communist radio stations an early advantage. This was achieved. However, by the late 1940s, this early lead had been lost already. By 1947, the music programs were being politicized. Quote of the Listening and Being Listened to book, page 143. In concrete terms, this meant broadcasting more folk music, more music from other socialist countries, especially the Soviet Union, radio plays, music and dance music based on socialist artistic concepts, and, if possible, no longer allowing Western cultural productions. By 1950, all programs had been politicized, including special programs for children, the youth, women, etc. For example, school programs, which resumed on October 15, 1945, were initially concerned with practical goals, training teachers and educating children. However, by 1949, all programs for young people were controlled by the FDJ, the Free German Youth, the youth organization of the communists. It was openly said that youth programs were the official radio programs of the FDJ. Programs for women changed the same way. Initially, the programs were rather conservative in nature, thereby very much fitting with the times, but the amount of socialist components for working women increased. Ironically, special programs for women were broadcast in the morning when working women couldn't listen to them, while housewives could. One oddity of the Soviet zone broadcasting was the huge amount of women among the staff. However, the simple reason for that was the heavy list when it came to the balance of men and women in the Soviet zone. War, flight, expulsion and prisoners of war were realities that caused the majority of the Soviet zone to be female. In 1946, for every 100 males, there were 135 females in the zone. By 1960, this had only slightly changed to a ratio of 100 to 122. That's the reason why the GDR was not able to remain as socially conservative as Western societies could. In 1949, the second East German radio station became online, the so-called Gemini radio station. It was mainly targeting Germans in the West, and it was a heavily politicized and aggressive radio station. It mainly recruited communists from the West or those that had spent some time there. Among them were Herbert Gessner, Willy Perk, and Karl Eduard von Schnitzler, who later became known for hosting the TV program The Black Channel. The main program of this radio station was called We Speak for West Germany. The program was designed in such a way that it seemed to broadcast news that were suppressed in the West and that it seemed to support the population of West Germany against oppression. Both the GDR and the Soviet Union were portrayed in an idealized way. The main enemies were the conservative West German Chancellor Adenauer and his government, but also the opposition party SPD, the Social Democratism, and the Cultural Barbarism, which was the name for any Western influence. A few finishing words. The Soviet zone radio broadcasting started with some advantages over the competition from the West into the post-war era. The broadcasting house, the transmitters, the musical archive, and the clear agenda of the occupation force, staff, and radio devices among the population. Quickly, the Berlin radio station became the #1 radio station in post-war Germany. However, because of how it was structured and run, politicized, patronizing, and not really entertaining, this early advantage was lost quickly, and Western alternatives like RIAS were able to gain loyal followers in both West and East. How this continued under the GDR leadership in the 1950s is something I'll discuss in a future episode. Thank you. This was History Lost in Time.